I welcome you. This has been the most incredible experience, from going to my friend Doug and Lisa's house, who are very involved with music, to meeting Sergey and Arkadi. And it happened that I was having a few people over for wine. And I said, well, why don't you come? And they said, well, no, we're going out to dinner. But then they came in, and they were the life of the party. They were so much fun. And then I heard from them, and they said, well, we would like to come and play music for you. And I thought about my house, which isn't a small house, but still, it was like way too small. And I thought, oh, I know where they could play music. Out of that has come this idea of having concerts here from time to time. And there has been so much enthusiasm on the part of people. Look at all the people who are here, but even more from the musicians who live in this area, who want a place to come and perform. It is the most exciting thing, other than my children, that has ever happened in my life. So thank you for coming. If you haven't been in this church before, this church was originally begun in I always say 59, but it might be 5 or 7. 56. Allie would know, because her father was a priest here for a while. It burned down, and then it was rebuilt again, and I think it was 1877 that the church itself really came to life. What I love is we redid this wonderful Three Marys window, and we did some history research on it, and it was commissioned for the death of a man named Dr. Shepherd, who built a house on 6th Street, right up here. Probably he built the house in 1860, 1870 or so. And when he had come to Petaluma by wagon train from St. Louis. And so every time I'm here, I look at the window and I think I am connected through Dr. Shepherd with a guy who came to Petaluma in a wagon train. So I love that. Our musicians, you have, where are they? They're not here yet. I mean, they're ready to come in, but
they're at the piano.
Oh, yes. Our musicians, Sergey and Arkadi, you probably have read, they were trained in Russia, undoubtedly in Moscow, at the Tchaikovsky Institute. They have played with the Bolshoi Orchestra. They came to the United States. They have played with the San Francisco Symphony. They have taught in the best schools. And they are here to play piano and viola for us. And we also have here, come up. Would you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your expertise in this?
I'm Kayleen Asbo, and it was my pleasure to teach at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music for almost 20 years and to do pre-concert lectures for the San Francisco Opera and the Santa Rosa Symphony. And so Gail has lured me out of retirement to do just a few minutes before we begin today.
Right. So thank you, Kayleen.
You're so welcome. One of the things that I love, can you hear me clearly? Okay, great. One of the things that music does so well is it binds us to each other across all kinds of divisions, all kinds of ideas that can get in the way. To use the phrase that Rumi says, there is a field beyond right and wrong. I will meet you there. And I think that music offers us an opportunity to bridge national conflicts and political conflicts and find the place where we really connect to the essence of what it is to be human beyond all divisions. And I think if one were to look at the history of Western classical music, the person who's done that better than anybody is Ludwig van Beethoven. And we find that Beethoven's music was actually used by both sides during World War II as a stirring call to find our courage. So tonight, we're going to be hearing 2 works by Beethoven. The first is a romance in F major that it was originally written for violin, but it has been transcribed for viola and piano rather than violin and orchestra. And if one were to listen to this and just try to guess what the state of mind the composer was in, you would probably come to the wrong conclusion, because the romance is this beautiful, lyrical, melodic, oh, it's so tuneful. It's the sort of kind of music, you know, go ahead and sway in your seats while you hear this. But the composer himself was profoundly troubled. He was almost entirely deaf at the time that he wrote this. He felt an enormous sense of conflict in his interpersonal relationships. He was profoundly troubled. In fact, he had just come through a period where he was so troubled that he contemplated suicide. And yet he gives us this gift of profound beauty in this romance. We're going to hear more of the Sturm and Drang in the second piece, which is his 32 variations in C minor. Now, C minor is, for Beethoven, the key that whenever he turns to it, it's like the key that he wrestles with to try to find his courage. The famous Fifth Symphony, you know, that's the key, C minor. And I'm going to invite you to listen and see if you can see that sort of fifth shaking of wrestling with fate and then coming to a sense of determination, of I will survive, I will persevere, no matter how horrible the world around me is, no matter how desperate things are inside of me, there is still yet music. And through music, Beethoven was an alchemist who transformed his personal and private pain into gold for all of us. And he gave it to the next generation. This is why Beethoven is, there's this famous painting that's just wonderful that's got Liszt at the piano, and there's all of these other musicians clustered around, and they have the bust of Beethoven sitting on top, because Beethoven was the one who really showed them that no matter how much grief they were experiencing in their own personal life, they could always find something beautiful. So the rest of our program then is going to include two of the people who absolutely worshipped Beethoven, and that's Robert Schumann, who was a music editor and who wrote article after article about why Beethoven's symphonies or why Beethoven's piano sonatas should be celebrated by everyone, and Johannes Brahms, who many people saw was Beethoven's heir. In fact, Schumann wrote a famous article that said to the world, hats off a genius. Here's the 21-year-old who's going to take off over the mantle of Beethoven. And so we're going to hear works by Schumann and Brahms for solo piano, and then we'll finish off with a transcription of the horn and adagio and allegro that's going to be played on viola and piano. But I want to leave you with one particular moment that always brings a lump to my throat when I think about the importance of music and the importance of having figures be people who incite us to courage. And that is that during a time in the 19th century where there was as violent a conflict in press as between supporters of Wagner and Liszt and supporters of Chopin and Mendelssohn, it was like the Republicans and the Democrats in our own time. The names that they called each other are really quite something to see. But both sides were united in their love of Beethoven. And they had different composers submit pieces of music to be published to create a statue. And the week before he died, Robert Schumann was in a psychiatric asylum, and Johannes Brahms came to visit him. And the two of them walked and they gathered flowers and they made a crown and they laid it at the foot of this statue of Beethoven. And so I just leave you with that image that there's something bigger than our divisions, that music is a voice not just to entertain us, but to inspire us to find our own courage and our own compassion. And that tonight, this evening, as we get to have these two wonderful musicians from Russia come to us bringing their love for these German composers, we're really celebrating what it is to be truly human. So enjoy tonight's performance.
greater.
invite you to come out and have a glass of wine or a glass of water or some crackers with us out on the patio. If those people who are going to go and rate the fruit